Okay, ESS topic 8. Now, in fact, this is only part of topic 8 and one subtopic of 1.4. In terms of resources and sustainability and carrying capacity, to me it makes a lot of sense to teach this stuff together. The IB disagrees, but anyways, I think it'll make sense, especially in this order, to learn about resources, the things we get from the earth, that's 8.2, how we can use those resources in a sustainable manner, meaning we can use them forever. That goes back to 1.4. And then in terms of resources, how humans can stay under carrying capacity, meaning similar to sustainability, using things in a way that can be done for eternity. Okay, so starting with 8.2, which is all about resources, the things we get from the earth. So just to sort of connect this holistically to ESS in general, why are resources and sustainability such a big environmental issue? And you need to understand different aspects of environmental science. So the first one, human population. Literally every day there's more people on Earth than the day before. Human population is the highest that it's ever been. And so just based on the fact that there's 7.6 billion people, and a few years from now there'll be 8 billion people, and then a few decades from now there'll likely be 10 billion people. It simply means we're using more resources. Not only that, the raw number of people, but the people on Earth are generally wealthier than previous generations. So as wealth goes up, consumerism goes up, diets change, meaning our lifestyles are taking more from the Earth. A lot of the things that we do take from the earth are non-renewable, meaning once we take them, we use them, dispose them, and they're gone forever. They're used up, known as a finite resource. Other resources may be renewable, but we often still deplete them. So this can be a confusing idea, but think about fisheries, which we just learned about. Obviously, fish are a renewable resource because fish have babies and produce more fish. If we have 1,000 salmon in a lake, by next year we could have 1,500 salmon, and then 2 years from there we could have 3,000 salmon. But if there's 1,000 salmon and we catch them all, we've squandered that renewable resource. Okay, so I just talked a lot, but let's paraphrase this. We act like Earth's resources are linear. We take things from the Earth, we use them, we discard them, and it's like a conveyor belt where we keep taking, but eventually we're going to run out of things to take. So we need to convert this to a circular lifestyle, known as a closed loop economy or circular economy. Those are synonyms. Basically, you take something, you use something, you reuse something, and then that drastically limits what you end up taking from the earth. A quick graphic just to show what I talked about. Here's our current economy. Take from the earth, make something with it, and then dispose of it. But if we can convert the things that we use to other things of value, it means that we drastically reduce what we are taking, because instead we are remaking or reusing or upcycling, recycling, all those different ways to reuse. Okay, a little bit of the vocab from 8.2, and most of these terms make sense, but it's important that we just start using these terminologies in terms of like using the correct IB, ESS terms in our writing, especially when it comes to a quiz or a test. So the first one, you've probably heard of this before as natural resources, but the IB calls it natural capital. So that means that in this class, we refer to it as natural capital. Anything that you get from nature that has value. And please realize that value is a pretty broad concept. Obviously, gold would be natural capital because gold is found naturally in the earth, and we all know that gold has value. It's very valuable. But there might be other things that are less obvious. Soil, all right? Maybe to you or I, soil is just dirt and it's not really valuable to us. But to a farmer, to certain economies, soil, especially nutrient-rich soil, is incredibly valuable. So we would absolutely consider soil to be a type of natural capital. And as I mentioned, value is a pretty broad term. So value can include goods and services. So goods are what we think of as value, like cut down a tree and you sell it to a lumber mill, or you catch a fish and sell it at the market. But services, like for example, the healthy soil that is going to make more nutritious soy or corn or beans or whatever we're growing, that would be a type of service. Um, Pollination from bees. You know, we don't directly receive anything from that, but the pollination indirectly is going to allow for more crops to be grown, more vegetables. And so those would kind of relate to services instead of goods. And we'll get into that in more detail in a couple slides. Next, I think this is sort of obvious, but we probably have never really thought much about it. Value and status of natural capital is dynamic. Dynamic simply means that it changes. And so basically all this is saying is that things change in their value. A couple examples. Guano, during the 1800s in Peru, was unbelievably valuable. So valuable that there were wars over it. You can Google the guano wars and see that people were literally fighting and killing each other over bird poop because in terms of growing crops, bird poop is full of phosphorus and nitrogen, and it was incredibly valuable because it led to healthier crops. Now we can make fertilizers synthetically, much worse for the environment, but more potent than bird poop. Opposite example, think about uranium. So uranium is valuable in terms of making nuclear weapons, but also nuclear energy. And so what was the value of uranium before the I guess, discovery of how to harness nuclear energy? It was pretty much worthless. In fact, it's probably less than worthless because uranium gives off radiation and can cause cancers. And so, you know, uranium had absolutely no benefit to us. But now that we can turn uranium into nuclear energy, it's incredibly valuable. And one of my favorite examples, I suggest you Google this as well. Diamonds have no real value until a Belgian company, De Beers, basically had the greatest marketing ploy of all time. In the late 1930s, as the US recession was ending, they just started a ad campaign that they invented the engagement ring. Basically, diamond engagement rings didn't exist. They weren't common, at least. And then this one company basically tricked men into and women into the idea that when you ask someone to marry you, you give them a diamond ring. And so they literally invented the value of diamonds pretty much out of thin air. So again, some interesting examples, but mostly just realize that natural capital status is dynamic. And then last but not least, natural capital can be renewable or non-renewable. And remember, just because something's renewable does not mean that we can't run out of it, like fish, for example. Interesting controversy between natural capital. You know, fresh water, clean air, are those natural capital, things that have value? Sure, but should they also be considered human rights, meaning, you know, that value shouldn't be bought or sold on the stock market? And we've talked about this. We know that rights to water can absolutely be bought and sold on the stock market. The question is that ethical or is that moral? Another quick example of natural capital, arable land. Arable means farmable. Things like arable land, the amount of land that you can farm on, it fluctuates due to things like technology, climate change. As we develop ways to irrigate, terrace farming, which you see in the picture, where you basically cut steps into a mountain, clearing forest for farmland, these are things that can increase the availability of this natural capital. But then desertification or landfills, these are things that could decrease the amount of arable land. Urban sprawl. Okay, this is a key distinction. Two terms that often get used interchangeably, but they should not be used interchangeably. The first one is natural capital. And I want you guys to think of natural capital as things that we take from nature. So whether it is lumber from a forest, or fish, or guano, bird poop, if we're taking it from nature for our use, think of it as natural capital. Whereas eco-services, these are, again, things with value, things that come from nature, but these are more given to us from nature. So examples of this would be water purification from wetlands or trees. Pollination services from honeybees. Again, that's the idea of our crops being pollinated. We're not taking that from nature, it's just given to us from nature, from bees. And so I would think of that more as an ecosystem service. There's always some that are sort of a gray area, like medicine from the rainforest. So rainforests have unbelievable biodiversity, meaning that a lot of really amazing medicines are discovered all the time from the rainforest. Is that a service or a capital? And I could sort of see both sides. So that one's like sort of in the middle. Okay, speaking of ecological services, 8 ecological services that we can acquire just due to biodiversity, just the fact that we have so much diversity of life on this planet. So a couple are pretty big, like all the energy in the biosphere. So all the energy in your body right now is because of all the food that you ever ate, and all the food that you ever ate came from photosynthesis. So even if you're eating meat, that meat, the energy in that meat came from an animal eating plants, and the plants got that energy from photosynthesis. The flow of materials, so nutrient cycling would definitely be an eco-service. Pollination, as I mentioned. Medicine, which you could asterisk, because medicine, I think, is somewhere in between a eco-service and natural capital. Soil formation. So soil is formed through the decay of dead plants and animals, decomposing over time. But then also soil is maintained through abiotic and biotic processes similar to eco-services. The moderation of weather extremes, so things like mangroves and wetlands will actually reduce things like flooding. They'll provide a reservoir of water to reduce the shortages of water during drought. A hurricane will actually be buffered if it hits a mangrove forest before land. And then lastly, nope, not lastly, second to last, purification of air and water, again, mostly by trees and soil. And lastly, a big one, carbon absorption. So all the carbon that gets absorbed by soil, by trees, by the oceans, absolutely an eco-service, something that we are given from nature. We are given the gift of not having too much carbon in the air based on nature taking it out. Obviously, we're doing a lot to add more and more carbon into the air, such as burning fossil fuels. Okay, so this is the list of 8 eco-services from biodiversity. All right, getting back to natural capital. I got a list here of 12 or so. You should be able to identify which ones are renewable and which ones are non-renewable. So pause the video and take a second to do so. All right, so I'll just list the renewable ones. Sun, obviously, is renewable. Fresh water is renewable. You haven't learned this yet, but the ozone layer actually is renewable. The ozone layer sort of heals itself, which is pretty incredible. Fisheries are renewable. Wind is renewable. Timber is renewable. And soil is renewable-ish. Interestingly, or maybe not interestingly, but the IB used to put soil in its own category of not renewable but replenishable, and then they decided that that was confusing, so they got rid of the term replenishable, and now it's sort of up to us to determine soil is renewable, but it's basically a very, very slow renewable resource. The natural rates of soil formation are about 1 inch every 100 years, so it's pretty interesting to think about, but if you dig down 10 inches into a forest, hypothetically, you're looking at like 1,000 years of soil formation. So it is renewable, it's just a lot slower of renewable resource. And then everything else on this list is not renewable. Now realize things like oil comes from uh, plants and animals that died millions of years ago. Although oil technically is renewable on a geologic timescale, it is not renewable in human terms. So we consider oil to be non-renewable. Same with these other resources, these other like minerals and rocks on the earth. Once we take them out and use them, they're gone. We don't have them anymore. No, this is important. Does renewable always mean sustainable? Absolutely not. Renewable resources can be mismanaged and used unsustainably. Again, put a note here. Just think about forests and fisheries. Those are great examples of and fresh water. Those are three resources that are all renewable, yet they're often used in unsustainable ways. So, good news is some resources can't be overused. We can't overuse the sun. We can't overuse the wind. But we could overuse those other aspects. Lastly, in terms of the use of natural capital, don't forget that just getting these things out of the earth is often environmentally harmful. So, whether it's gold or copper or uranium or even timber, getting these natural resources can be fairly harmful. So just think about timber. You got to run a lot of fossil fuels to run the machinery to get to the forest and then cut down and ship the trees. Resources from the earth need to be mined. Mining is a very environmentally harmful practice. They need to be transported, processed, discarded. Each step along the way is going to be harmful to some degree to the earth. An interesting sort of catch-22 is the resources used in solar panels. So it should be pretty obvious that solar panels are sustainable and awesome and could potentially save the planet. But silica is the main ingredient in a solar panel. So realize that solar panels are sustainable, but silica is mostly mined in China. A lot of it is done against labor laws, using child labor, using unsafe practices. A lot of it is done fairly unsustainably, so cheap and dirty techniques to drill into the earth to mine the silica. So solar panels technically are not sustainable because the materials used to make a solar panel are not sustainable. So solar energy is absolutely sustainable, but building solar panels is technically not sustainable. So just an interesting thing to think about. Please don't overthink this. Solar energy is still way better than coal or oil or gas. Just because there's one unsustainable component to solar energy does not make it worse than those fossil fuels. And you build a solar panel, you use some silica, which comes from the earth, it's not renewable, but then you get free, cheap, and clean energy for the next 20 years or whatever the life of that solar panel is. So, not against solar energy, but it's just an interesting caveat to think about in terms of the natural capital use and the non-renewable aspects of building a solar panel. Okay. We don't need to write anything down here because I do want to discuss in class the idea that natural capital has value. Does value always equal money? No. If this was economics class, then sure, we would be talking about value in terms of monetary goods. But values can be, and we'll go into this more depth, economic value, environmental value, aesthetic value, cultural value, ethical value, intrinsic value, or even spiritual value. So again, I know I went through that slide fast, but we'll talk about it when we get back in class. Okay, trying to actually assess those different values. Biological value can be tangible. Tangible, I don't want to say that it means real because I don't want to say that the other types of values aren't real, but tangible value is sort of like can be weighed or can be easily seen. Maybe we can discuss in class what this means, but examples of tangible value would be economic value, ecological value. So things that directly benefit humans. It can often be difficult to calculate. So economic value is going to be easier to calculate. Cut down, and we're going to talk about that big oak tree on 19 Mile. It's the front of the parking lot. It's the tree of knowledge. That oak tree is probably 100 years old. That would be my guess. But anyways, we could cut down that oak tree and sell oak to a cabinet maker, and oak is fairly valuable, and then we would have a clear, tangible amount that we sell that oak tree and we get $2,000 or whatever the raw price of lumber is. Or we let that tree grow and it continues to remove CO2 out of the air. It's preventing erosion by its roots holding the soil in place. It's filtering out water pollutants. It's potentially even limiting flood by absorbing excess water. And that value, although it's real, it's fairly difficult to calculate. And then the other types of value that are almost in the realm of TOK, and kind of hard for me to truly understand as a person with a science background, intrinsic value. Value for its own sake. So this could be the value of aesthetics, the value of the moral value of that tree. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in class, but talking about the value of that oak tree in less tangible ways. So again, two main categories of biological value. You have the tangible values, economic and ecological. Then you have the intrinsic values, which are more the aesthetic or moral values. Global economic biological value. You don't need to write anything down here, but it's pretty amazing to me. So we've talked about this, but here's just the list of the things we're given from nature, eco-services, or the things that we take from nature, natural capital. If we were to measure this, if we were to try to add up all this stuff from nature, how much do we get from it? Any guesses? I'm almost certain that your guess was too low, because all this stuff is worth about $38 trillion a year. More than most governments, more money than, I don't even know how much like money there is on Earth. I'm gonna pause real quick. Okay, so according to my quick search, there's about $350 trillion on Earth. Just that's how much money the Earth has, or how much people have on Earth. So we're looking at about 10% of that is given to us by nature every year. Now, here's the interesting part, and here's the part that makes this a difficult concept. Realize that a lot of these things don't specifically give money. So again, fisheries and forests are pretty obvious. You harvest that stuff from nature, you sell it, and you specifically get money for it. But a lot of these things, it's not that we're given money for it, it's that we don't lose money by not having it. A great example of this would be erosion control. There's a bunch of forests on a hill in California, and those forests are keeping the city in the valley safe from a mudslide. That city doesn't like earn any money by not being covered in mud, but those trees are keeping that city safe and saving that city a lot of money. But here's the problem: because we don't often see the value of that, we look at a short-term solution. We cut down the trees on the hill, on the mountain. We sell those trees for a little bit of economic value. Now that those trees' roots are no longer holding the ground in place, there's a rainstorm. The rainstorm leads to a mudslide. The mudslide barrels into the city and costs millions or billions of dollars worth of damage to houses and infrastructure and property loss. And we now realize, oh, the value of those trees on the mountain were $20 million, but we didn't realize it. But now that we cut down the trees and the city is under a mudslide, we've lost $20 million. And so a lot of these services, like think about climate and weather regulation. You know, trees are absorbing CO2, keeping our climate a little bit cooler. If we didn't have those trees, we would have more extreme weather. We would have more hurricanes. It's pretty hard to measure directly, but we do know that we would be losing a whole lot of money if we didn't have those eco services. Okay, and then the last topic from 8.2 is the idea of natural income. Natural income is the growth of natural capital over time, meaning the representation of future value of economic or ecological value. Usually natural income is measured more on the economic side, like actual dollars. So again, this definition might be a little confusing, but we'll do a quick practice problem, and I think it'll make more sense. So again, the growth of natural capital, we're not talking about how much natural capital you have. We're talking about how much natural capital has grown over a specific period of time. So a couple examples. A forest has 20,000 tons of biomass, and we'll just say that's pretty much trees. But 5 years from now, that forest is going to continue to grow and have 22,000 tons of biomass. So in terms of natural capital, we would say that the forest today has 20,000 tons of natural capital. The forest in 5 years has 22,000 tons of natural capital, meaning that was a natural income of 2,000 tons, because natural income is the growth of natural capital. The natural capital grew by 2,000 tons. A pastoral ranch had 35 sheep last year and 40 sheep this year. What is the natural income of that ranch? Tough math question here. Hopefully you came up with 5. 5 sheep. Make sure you have your units. If you answer 5 on that question, I would mark it wrong. But 5 sheep is the natural income. Those sheep multiplied and grew by 5. Now this is important in terms of natural income. These two examples, did the timber company or the herdsman actually make money from this? No, but it is representative of future wealth. Their future wealth has absolutely increased, because if a company owns a forest with 22,000 tons of trees, that forest is worth more than a forest with 20,000 tons of trees. If you own 40 sheep, you have you're likely your net worth has increased, even though like the actual dollars in your bank account hasn't increased. 40 sheep is more valuable than 35 sheep, so future wealth indications have increased. And so again, natural income, hopefully that makes sense. But if you have any questions about this, I know this topic right here can often lead to just some confusions. It's just a unique topic or a unique idea. So please bring questions to class if you have that. Okay, I believe that is it for 8.2. Have a good one. Okay, topic 1.4, so a bit out of order, but I think 1.4 and 8.2 go hand in hand. Sustainability. Let's start with the definition of sustainability. Meeting present needs without compromising needs of future generations. To simplify, sustainable means you can do something forever. An add-on to sustainability is the idea of sustainable development, development meaning to build. So this would be building, whether it's buildings or infrastructure, or roads, or developing cities, again, to meet current needs without compromising future generations. Those of you that are kind of up in the air about what you want to do with your career, if I could do things over, although I really enjoy teaching, I think sustainable development would just be a very interesting field. And I think with our new president coming into office, the possibilities of like a new Green Deal, maybe not the multi-trillion-dollar Green Deal proposed last year, but I just think there's going to be a lot of opportunity in this field, that cities in this country that were built in the 1920s and running on 100-year-old infrastructure need to be redesigned and remade. So the idea of sustainable architecture, me personally, I would have gone into sustainable landscaping. So the idea of how do we build our gardens and our farms and our parks in a way that is sustainable, a way that uses native plants, a way that's restorative by nature. But anyways, I think sustainable architecture, sustainable design, sustainable anything, I think would be a job in pretty high demand over the next couple decades. Okay, so the idea of sustainability was first developed by a ecologist named Garrett Hardin in the 1960s. And this doesn't like directly relate, it's not directly on the ESS guide, but I think knowing a little bit about the background helps us understand this idea. So he studied English commons in the 1600s. He was in the 1960s, but he looked at historical records of commons in the 1600s, and he saw that common areas were overused and they depleted resources, meaning they were used unsustainably over and over again. Basically, it seemed to be like human nature to overuse a resource. And a common is basically a shared area. And so it starts with unregulated access to a shared resource. So for example, sheep in a pasture that's really owned by no one, that would be a shared resource. And people can let their sheep graze and eat at the pasture. People have the mindset of harvesting the largest amount over the shortest period of time. The mindset of if I don't, someone else will. So if everyone has one sheep out there, someone's going to think, you know what, why don't I put 2 sheep out there and maybe get a little extra? And then other people see that and they say, well, maybe I'm going to put 3 sheep out there. And then you basically have this escalating conflict that leads to overuse and depletion of resources. And so again, Hardin was able to see over and over again resources getting depleted, and it pretty much always occurred during shared common resources. You can use the resource below carrying capacity, but as users increase their usage of that common, it goes beyond carrying capacity meaning the maximum amount that you can use, and eventually it leads to depletion, degradation, ruining the resource, whatever that resource may be. How do we prevent this? 2 ways. Number 1, regulated access, so fair rights, having like specific laws in place that each person can only have 2 sheep in the common area. An example of this would be the Great Lakes Accord. The Great Lakes are actually a pretty well managed freshwater resource. So notice when we did those projects on freshwater conflicts, the Great Lakes weren't on there. The Colorado River and the Rio Grande have been fought over. The Jordan River and the Aral Sea, which is like the example of freshwater mismanagement. But the Great Lakes, basically shared by 6 states and 3 Canadian provinces, and generally speaking, they do a pretty good job keeping that water equitable, clean, thinking long-term about the use of that resource. And then private ownership is obviously one possibility for like the sheep in the common area. You could just divide it up and everyone has their own area. But realize that a lot of resources like the ocean, like the air, pollution, those can't be privatized. Those are shared by everybody. So if one company is spewing toxic fumes into the air, that is breathed and shared by all. But regardless, this results in sustained benefits, sustainability. So again, if we look at the Garrett Hardin example, when the sheep were all in the shared area, people were adding more sheep, and eventually overusing it. Let's say there was 9 users doing that. If we divided up the common area into 9 equal spots, people would just be a lot smarter about it. Again, we overfish the oceans because we think other countries and other fishermen fleets will catch the fish if we don't, so we just try to catch as many as possible. But if you had a private lake, you're not going to have that same race, that same mindset of I need to catch as many as I can as fast as possible. You'd probably be thinking the opposite of what's the right number to catch to stay under maximum sustainable yield and allow this natural capital to grow over time, meaning how could I allow natural income to take place? So a couple examples. is this sustainable? Just look at the diagram, take a second, and make a guess. No, it's not. Why not? Because right here, regardless of how efficient we can be turning the coal into heat and then electricity, the raw resource of coal is non-renewable. Now realize fossil fuels do renew, but at such a slow pace, like we're talking millions and millions of years, so we consider them non-renewable. Because that raw resource is non-renewable, this whole process is unsustainable because it can't be done forever and ever. Okay, this one's a little bit more complicated. Again, pause the video, look at the diagram, and try to determine, is this sustainable or not sustainable? Okay, technically, yes, this is sustainable because this is basically a closed loop system. Plants use phosphorus. Phosphorus, when the plants die, end up back in the soil, runs off into the ocean, turns into basically marine like layers of ocean, and that phosphorus basically gets recycled back into the earth to be used by plants anymore. Now, this right here is the key, because if we are taking phosphorus out of mines a lot faster than the ocean is returning it to the earth, then we're doing it unsustainably. So phosphorus does renew itself. Right now, unsurprisingly, we take phosphorus out of the ground faster than it's being replenished. So right now we are doing this process unsustainably. This has potential to be a sustainable resource. Interesting fact, most of the phosphorus on Earth comes from Morocco. So when you buy fertilizer at the store and the fertilizer has nitrogen and phosphorus in it, most of that phosphate was dug up out of a mine in Morocco. Just throughout history, that's where a lot of the phosphorus returns end up. But this process could be sustainable, but is most likely not. Okay, last one. All right, should be obvious, this is sustainable. The wind is never going to get used up. The wind is not going to ever run out. The sun powers the wind, and the sun is going to be here forever. Now again, before you correct me, yes, I know the sun is going to burn out in like 8-point-something billion years, but again, we're thinking about human terminologies. Humans will be long gone before the sun burns out. And so as far as we're concerned, the wind is a sustainable resource, not going anywhere. Some disagreement about that in Congress. So Joe Barton is actually on the Environmental Ways and Means Committee, meaning he makes decisions on energy policy in this country. And this is an actual quote from Joe Barton from Texas. Wind is a finite resource, and harnessing it would slow the winds down, which would cause the temperature to go up. So he made the argument that we need to actually burn more oil and coal to prevent climate change, because if we use wind power, we're going to steal the wind will be gone, and then temperatures will get really hot. Again, this individual is on the Environmental Ways and Means Committee, meaning this person makes decisions on U.S. Energy policy, which is a bit frightening. Okay, next concept, sustainable yield. Again, we've talked about this a little bit in the fisheries unit, and so this is mostly review. The rate of natural capital use without depleting the original stock. Basically, yield meaning to take, amount, using that yield, harvesting, in a sustainable way. Now this is important because this might seem obvious now that you know it, but we probably wouldn't have connected the two. Sustainable yield is always equal to the rate of natural income. So think back to the examples of the previous subtopic. 35 sheep this year, 40 sheep next year. What's the natural income? The natural income is 5 sheep. If I asked you, what would be the maximum sustainable yield of those sheep, it would be 5. Because if we go 35 to 40 and then we take 5, we're back to that starting area, meaning hypothetically, we could take 5 sheep every year and keep going back to that original stock, that original amount. Remember, natural income is the rate of growth of natural capital. It has nothing to do with the starting amount. It's the starting amount to the new amount. That is that growth, that natural income. Now, you know what? I realize I put these in red, but you might want to write them down because when I say sustainable yield is equal to rate of natural income, I don't mean that those are the same, because those are two different terms. I mean that like the actual number would be the same. So if you're solving it mathematically, it would be the same number, but the natural income is the rate of growth, and the sustainable yield is the usage of that growth of natural capital. Again, please star highlight. Now's a great time to like write a question in the margin of your notes, so when we recap, I can try to use an analogy or try to break it down further. I'm happy to. Oh, and then lastly, something we've already talked about, maximum sustainable yield. So same concept, same idea, but this is the absolute most that you can use. So going back to the sheep, 35 sheep today, 40 sheep next year. The sustainable yield would be anywhere from 0 to 5 sheep. You could use 0 sheep, 1 sheep, 2 sheep, and those would all be sustainable. What's the maximum sustainable yield? It would be 5 sheep. Because if you harvested 7 sheep and we went from 35 to 40, and then we harvested 7 sheep, now we're down to 33, meaning we're below that starting stock. So we're now above maximum sustainable yield, meaning we are not acting sustainably. I just said that. Usage must be at or below MSY to be sustainable. Another example, again, pretty similar in terms of like a math question to the natural income stuff. So there's 50,000 kilograms of trees in a forest. Each year, 10,000 trees grow, 10,000 kilograms of trees grow, 2,000 kilograms of trees are lost due to herbivores. What's the maximum sustainable yield? Okay, a common wrong answer would be 58,000, because we take 50,000, add 10,000, we get to 60, minus 2,000, we get to 58. But realize that that's the total natural capital, but we want to know the growth of that natural capital. How much can we take and go back to that starting amount? So realize this doesn't matter, because this number right here is our starting value. So this number can be anything. It could be 1,000,000, it could be 2, but we just want to know how to get back to that. So growth of 10,000, loss of 2,000, pretty straightforward. 8,000, don't forget the units, 8,000 kilograms of trees. So I might give Mr. Cardin like half a point here, because 8,000 kilograms of what? Could be anything. 8,000 kilograms of trees, biomass. The IB is going to make it a little bit more complicated. So this would be an example of like an IB type question. Pause the video, try to answer it. $40,000. You look at the growth and you look at the losses. Again, that original number doesn't matter, because we're trying to get back to that original number. Questions about this, please, again, jot them down. I'm happy to discuss in class. Okay, so the last part of sustainability is how to assess sustainability, meaning how to test it, how to measure it. So we got 3 ways: environmental indicators, EIAs, environmental impact assessments, and then lastly, eco footprints. You've probably heard of that last one, and the last one is what we'll probably spend the most time on. So first, let's start with environmental indicators. There's these different aspects of the world that can be measured to indicate if things are healthy, if things are sustainable. we can measure these things locally, regionally, or even globally. Sometimes they can be pretty straightforward, other times they can be pretty complex. So an obvious one, a river is filled with wildlife upstream of the factory. Downstream of the factory, it is orange and there's no wildlife. So that would be an environmental indicator of ecosystem health. That upstream of the factory, the ecosystem is healthy, whereas downstream of the factory, the ecosystem is very unhealthy. Another obvious example, this would be more of a regional example. Phoenix had 1 million people living there in 1970, and today it has 4 million people living there. Phoenix is in the middle of a desert. There's no natural fresh water source. So this is a problem. This is an environmental indicator of unsustainability, the fact that we've gone from 1 to 4 million people over 50 years. And then a little bit more complex. How have human-caused climate change or anthropogenic climate change impacted biodiversity in the tropics? So that's going to take a lot of assessment. We're going to have to look at biodiversity. We're going to look at pollution. We're going to look at changes in soil structure and amount of forest fragmentation and habitat loss. And that's going to be probably like a multi-level, multi-year question to answer. An example of an environmental indicator summit is the 2000 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This was basically a meeting in the year 2000 where leaders from all over the globe got together to basically try to assess the current state of planet Earth. The assessment basically was not surprising that Earth, we need to change our behaviors to try to protect and treat Earth sustainably. Okay, next is an EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. So EIAs help to determine the impacts of environmental projects. It's basically like a big document, a big study that takes place to measure the sustainability or the potential sustainability of a piece of development. I know I mentioned sustainable development at the beginning of this topic. You know, someone who works in sustainable development would either be writing EIAs or reading and assessing EIAs. An environmental lawyer would read and maybe argue the merits or the validity of an EIA. So if there's a big piece of development, let's say a new school is being built, a new hydropower dam, an airport, a bridge, before the actual building starts, it's a big assessment that needs to take place. So you look at the implications of this development socially, how's it going to affect the people in the area, economically. So think about an airport as an example. Socially, an airport might be a great thing. It might allow people in a previously sort of isolated area to travel. And economically, it could provide jobs. But environmentally, an airport could be pretty damaging. An airport is a huge piece of noise pollution, so it could affect maybe an endangered species of frog or bird that relies on noise for communication. There's going to be habitat destruction, so an airport needs to go somewhere where it was probably a prairie or a wetland, probably some sort of flat ecosystem. And so often we have to weigh sort of the juxtaposition, would that be the right term? The contrast, I'll say, between maybe the economic value, the social value, and then the environmental drawbacks of different types of development. Usually the EIA is like the first step of development, and then an environmental audit follows. An environmental audit would be like a more specific study of the actual, I guess, more measurable environmental economic impacts. The audit is basically like a more detailed, more precise version of certain aspects of the EIA. EIAs are not perfect. They vary country by country. There's really no like international standard of what needs to be in an EIA, what an EIA, you know, the value of the environment versus the economy. There's no standard for that. So if a country really wants a new airport, they could basically write their own version of an EIA to say, yeah, an airport won't have any environmental drawbacks, and then they'll get the airport. I kind of mentioned this, so there's no set of standards, and then socioeconomic factors can often sway decisions. So let's say a new baseball stadium is going to be built, and that baseball stadium is going to go on an endangered wetland, and species may go extinct, and it might harm ecosystem services. Again, think about all the value of a wetland, like keeping us safe from floods and purifying water, where you don't measure the benefits of it right away, but then when you destroy that wetland and pollution is no longer being absorbed and cancer rates go up in that area, clearly that's a big cost, social cost and economic cost that's kind of hard to measure. But guess what? If the mayor of the city or if the governor really wants a baseball stadium and the people want a baseball stadium, that EIA could basically get swayed in the way that it's written. And then this would probably be the biggest drawback of EIAs. Industries can run their own EIAs. So, like literally, the company that builds airports could hire their own scientist and say, "Hey, scientist, we'll give you $25,000 if you write an EIA that we like." And obviously, ethically, some scientists would. Most scientists would not do that because they're going to write an EIA that's accurate regardless of whether they like it or not. But there's something in industry called hack scientists, which are basically scientists for hire. This was popular in the 1960s through 90s with tobacco companies. Tobacco companies would basically hire out-of-work scientists to publish findings that cigarettes don't cause cancer. Libertarian think tanks have scientists on staff that find research that climate change isn't real. Not surprisingly, or maybe this is surprisingly, it's often the same exact scientist. So Fred Singer comes to mind. He was like the leading scientist showing that nicotine and tobacco don't cause cancer. And then a couple decades later, he's now the leading scientist trying to show that climate change isn't real. Clearly, Fred Singer is a hack. He's not yes, he has a PhD, but is he an ethical scientist? No, absolutely not. He's a scientist for hire. So the EIA can be broken down into 9 steps. These steps do appear in the ESS curriculum, but as far as I know, I've never seen like a question that asks students to recite all 9 steps or break down the different steps. So we'll go through this fairly quickly. You start with the screening process of determining, is a project big enough where an EIA is needed, or could you just do like a much smaller environmental audit? Scoping, which is what are the big environmental issues that this development will impact? Is it going to affect water or air quality? Is it the land use that we care about? A baseline study, which is sort of like gathering the control information, like the starting info. Impact prediction. Impact assessment, that's the actual like studies this is where an environmental scientist would come in and actually study how might this bridge or dam or airport or stadium affect the nearby river or the soil quality. The mitigation plan, which is a plan to then try to address the assessment. So this project is going to harm A, B, and C. How can we reduce those harms? Then we move on to the EIS, which is the public version of the EIA. The EIS review, which is basically a big meeting where the decision takes place of, okay, we are going to build this thing, but based on what the scientists say, all these factors that could occur based on this development, we now need to decide should this process actually take place. And then last but not least, after the EIA occurs and assuming the plan is approved, the EIA gets revisited a couple years later to determine how accurate it was, and then it improves future EIAs. Now, here's the deal. I didn't go into super depth about EIAs. To me, it's not the most exciting thing about environmental studies, a big legal document that occurs before development, but it is in your ESS guide. So absolutely take a minute. It can either be now, it can be before the quiz, but read up on EIAs in your ESS guide, like the benefits and the drawbacks. You should be able to evaluate EIAs. And again, I sort of skipped over that in the lecture, but you still are responsible for knowing it. It's in the ESS guide. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, the last way to assess sustainability is probably the one that applies to us most because this can be done on an individual level, and that is ecological footprints. Ecological footprints are a measurement of how resources and area are needed for a person to live based on their current lifestyle. Sorry, a measurement of how much resources and area are needed for a person to live their current lifestyle. This is a nice little diagram that sort of shows the breakdown of an eco footprint. It's even shaped like a foot, which is kind of cute. But anyways, just think about your lifestyle and think about how much land is required for you to live. And don't think of this about like your house and your property. Because I live on a 6,000 square foot lot. It's about 60 feet wide and 100 feet deep. That's like 0.1 acres. But that's not how much land is required for me to live. That just happens to be where I live. In terms of the land required for me, think about everything that I eat and the fact that everything I eat needs to come from bioproductive land. Also realize if I'm eating on higher trophic levels like meat or especially beef, it means I require a lot more land. How much land is required for the energy that I use? And one thing that gets a little bit confusing, I think people pretty much know that if you drive a car, your eco footprint goes higher. If you drive an SUV or a gas guzzler, then your eco footprint's huge. But why is that? It's because by burning fossil fuels, we require a lot of trees to offset that pollution. Fossil fuels release CO2 and trees absorb CO2. So the fact that I drive to school every day 20 miles each way, so 40 miles there and back over a week, that's 200 miles of driving. That's a lot of trees that are required because of my lifestyle to absorb the CO2 that I put in the air due to the gasoline that I'm burning. Now, I drive a hybrid car, so my car goes about 60 miles per gallon, meaning over a full week of driving to the IA and back, I only burn about 3 gallons of gas, so that's less than a lot of people who might drive like a big truck to school. Mr. Bohannon, Mr. Pete. I think Mr. Tapp's buying a truck too, so you can ask him about his gas mileage. But anyways, it comes down to how much land, whether it's direct or indirect, is needed for you to live the current way that you do. Think about all the consumption that you do, the different things that you buy. We talked about jeans last unit. So if you're buying a new pair of jeans once a month, that's a lot of cotton required for you to live your lifestyle. And all those fields of cotton would be calculated into your eco footprint. Okay, so this next part, you don't need to necessarily write down, but we are going to discuss in class, and I am going to call on a few of you guys. So look at this different list of 8 activities or 8 lifestyles. And you should be able to hypothesize whether these things are going to increase or decrease your eco footprint. And more importantly, or as important, you should be able to describe why these things increase or decrease your eco footprint. Some of them are pretty obvious, like I'd say number 1 and number 3 are pretty obvious. But again, you should be able to justify like specifically how measurably does number 1 and number 3 increase your eco footprint. Others are less obvious, especially like number 6 and number 8. I definitely think that there's right answers for that one, but you might be able to argue and convince me otherwise. So again, just take a look now, but we will discuss in class. Another thing to understand is eco footprints have increased throughout history. And again, that seems like kind of a no-brainer, but let's just look at something as simple as shoes. So those are shoes on the left from 1,000 years ago, and then those are shoes on the right from a couple years ago. And just think about the process of the shoes, think about the materials, think about the local aspect of the shoes on the left. So the shoes on the left were definitely made by local materials, and they were then either bought or sold or traded or used locally. The shoes on the right were probably built from raw materials all over the world. They were probably assembled in Southeast Asia and then shipped across the Pacific, distributed from California, and then bought by someone in the U.S. So just think about that whole process of something as simple as the shoes that we wear and the impact that had on the earth 1,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago when shoes were made from leather from a cow that was slaughtered probably within 100 miles of the person buying the shoe. Whereas today, shoes are pretty much manufactured in Asia and then shipped around the world. So your eco footprint is going to vary greatly just based on the type of country that you live in. So here's a map where the size of the country is bigger or smaller based on its eco footprint. And so notice how swollen the countries of the United States, Japan, and then several countries in Western Europe. Like it looks like England, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, those countries are all basically overutilizing resources. And so, your eco footprint is going to be big no matter your lifestyle. Just the fact that you live in the United States, you rely on fossil fuels much more than someone who maybe lives in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, if you look at the countries in Africa, those countries are shrunk, meaning they're using much less resources. So even being green in this country, you're probably going to have a bigger eco footprint than someone who maybe is less concerned about the environment, but just happens to be born in another country that uses a lot less resources. So overall, MEDCs are going to have a much larger footprint. LEDCs are going to have a much smaller footprint. A couple examples of these, of why. So this was a really cool National Geographic like photojournalism piece from a few years ago, where the photographer had families take pictures with everything that they own. And so here's a family in India that's not necessarily poor. We may look at their possessions and think that they don't have a lot, but depending on their lifestyle, they might have enough. And you notice a few things like their transportation, one bicycle for the whole family. So you got a little bit of fossil fuels to create that bicycle, and then it is carbon neutral for the life of the bicycle. In terms of food, we got 3 bags of probably grains, so things like rice or wheat or millet. I don't see any meat. I don't see any packaging. So right away, that's going to reduce eco footprint. Similarly, we have a family in Mali, Northern Africa. Look at the construction of their house. I can almost guarantee that that is all local materials. Again, you look at the stuff that they own, it's pretty much necessities, nothing too frivolous. Again, transportation in the back there, 1 bicycle for the family. Contrast that with a MEDC family, the Yukita family in Japan. We got a lot of stuff. We got a lot of electronics. Look at that front row. Look at all those shoes. Shoes for different occasions, whereas the family in Mali probably just owns a pair of shoes, and that's their shoes that they wear no matter if they're going to school or work or a wedding, where here we have different shoes for different occasions. And then, of course, the American family with their 2 trucks and their dog. Realize that pets use a whole lot of resources just to keep them alive. Again, all their stuff, all their things, and that's all going to be a part of the family's eco footprint. And then obviously food is a major factor of eco footprint. So we've talked about this before, but someone who eats meat is going to have over double the carbon emissions than someone who doesn't eat meat. This is indirect. It's not like someone who eats meat has CO2 pouring out of their body at a high rate, but it's indirectly all those processes to get the meat. The second trophic level aspect is what's going to lead to those higher CO2 emissions. Water is going to be a part of your eco footprint, and we see different types of food are going to have different amounts of water. Again, not surprisingly, beef is going to have a huge water footprint compared to vegetables. Similar photojournalism project, this time with food. So you have a family in Ecuador. Notice that their food is pretty much all primary producers. I don't think I see any meat there. Pretty much no packaging. The packaging that I do see is probably reusable, and I can almost guarantee that all that food is locally grown, meaning we call it the food miles traveled. The food did not have to travel very far to get to this family. We get to the American family. Again, just look at the packaging, look at the different trophic levels, the fact that a lot of this food was grown in other parts of the world and then shipped to us. It's pretty amazing, but like, it's cheaper to get an apple grown in China than grown in Michigan. And the reason is probably pretty obvious that if you grow an apple in China, you can pay the farmers a lot less. If you grow an apple in Michigan, you have to pay them a higher living wage. So even though it's much more devastating on the environment to ship an apple from China to Michigan, think about all the fossil fuels of those food miles. But because of that, we get a lot of our food in the U.S. Packaged and shipped from all over the world. A couple misconceptions when it comes to eco footprints. So the first one, a bus versus a car. It is pretty obvious that a bus burns a lot more gasoline than a car. However, a person who rides the bus has a smaller eco footprint than someone who drives a car. Explain how this is possible. So again, if you want to write yourself a little note, I will call on one or two of you next class to explain why, even though a bus burns a lot more gas than a car, if I rode the bus to school instead of driving my car, even though I drive a hybrid, I'd probably have a smaller eco footprint. Same logic here for another misconception. If someone lives in a single family house versus someone lives in a big apartment. So the big apartment is obviously going to use more electricity, more heat to moderate the house. But the person in the big apartment complex is going to have a smaller footprint than the person who lives in a small single family house. Okay, so we are going to measure our eco footprints. Two questions that I want you guys to think about. Number one, what types of measurements do you think we will do to find our eco footprints? And then number two, compare yourself to the class. Do you think that your eco footprint will be bigger or smaller than the class average? So of the class of 18 of you, someone's going to have the biggest eco footprint and someone's going to have the smallest based on your lifestyle, where you live, what you eat, your consumption habits, your travel habits. How do you think you'll compare to the class? And we'll see how accurate you are. Again, for this page, sorry, I'm out of order. Just jot down a couple answers here. I know this is red, but we'll discuss in class. Okay, the last subtopic of topic 8 is 8.4, which deals with human carrying capacity and eco footprint. So obviously, this relates to topic 1.4 with eco footprint and sustainability. And then carrying capacity relates to both resource use, 8.2, and also human populations, which is 8.1, and we kind of keep 8.1 totally separate from the rest of this. But let's first just think about the idea of carrying capacity in terms of ecosystems. So a carrying capacity, which is abbreviated K, is basically how much of a population can survive without overusing its resources. So we don't really think about it in terms of sustainability with like a natural resource, but think about like deer in Michigan. Only so many deer can survive in Michigan, and if the population of deer is above carrying capacity, it's going to lead to a crash because it means the amount of deer are going to overuse the resource, they're going to graze too much, disease is likely to spread, and then it's going to come crash down to carrying capacity or even below. The things that affect carrying capacity are biotic potential. So think about those deer in Michigan, all the factors that allow them to breed and survive and reproduce and grow as a population. And then environmental resistance are the things like competition and lack of resources that keeps their population from growing exponentially, like a math equation. So it's the exact same concept of carrying capacity in relationship to ecosystems, but now we're talking about humans. And so we're thinking about, okay, what are the factors that cause human populations to grow? What are the factors that push down human populations? And how does this relate to the idea of carrying capacity of not really an ecosystem, but carrying capacity of planet Earth? So the first thing to realize is that carrying capacity with humans is a very different process than, or a different concept than carrying capacity with natural ecosystems because of this, because humans can sort of determine their own biotic potential. Our growth rate is sort of determined by societal measures and economics and even political aspects of our life, whereas with wild species in an ecosystem, biotic potential is just based on evolution, survive and reproduce. That's basically the point of life if you are a wild species. But with humans, we have all these other aspects to it. So some aspects of life, and again, we're going to get into this in topic 8.1 in more detail. Like a rural economy is going to increase birth rate because you need a lot of kids on the farm to help work. Traditional cultures where women are expected to not go to college, not have a career, and just kind of be moms, they're going to have more kids. The opposite of that, urbanized economies, availability of contraception, education for women, these factors are going to decrease biotic potential. And then besides that, we can also increase and decrease carrying capacity. So again, natural wild species, there's only so much food in their ecosystem. Their habitat is only so big. Whereas with humans, we can use technology to increase our carrying capacity. For example, if we figure out a cheap, sustainable way to desalinate water from the ocean, right away, that means we have way more fresh water to irrigate crops and provide food for more people. And that's going to increase human carrying capacity by a lot. Genetically modified organisms, green energy, there's definitely aspects that can increase our carrying capacity. Now, on the other end of that, droughts and crop failures, we continue to demand more consumption, higher meat demand, more consumerism, bigger footprints. That will definitely decrease our carrying capacity. If everyone on Earth lived like Americans, we wouldn't be able to have 7 billion people. We might only be able to fit 1 billion people on Earth. If everyone on Earth lived like the average Congolese citizen, then we could fit maybe double the amount of people on Earth because of the small footprint. So if we try to actually look at this concept mathematically of eco-footprint and carrying capacity, let's look at it on a whole Earth level. How many people, how much land per person? So let's just look at the numbers. There's 33 billion acres of arable land on Earth. Keyword there is arable. Arable means farmable, so we don't count the Sahara Desert. We don't count Antarctica because that land is not really used for farming, for bioproductive land. There's 7.6 billion people. Amount of land divided by the amount of people. Okay, now we have an actual number, 4.3 acres per person. Every person on Earth is basically allotted 4.3 acres. That's what we have, but this is what we use. All right, so obviously if we all get 4.3 acres, but on average we use 5.6 acres, that's a problem. That means that we're in a deficit. That's sort of like being in credit card debt, where you make $2,000 a month, but you spend $2,200 a month. That is a major issue. Same thing here. We're allowed 4 acres per person, but we're using 5.5 acres per person. Clearly, this is not sustainable. This is considered overshoot or a deficit of 23%. What happens in ecosystems when a population is way above carrying capacity? There's a crash. There's mass starvation and famine and spread of disease. And we might be heading towards a similar thing with humans. So Earth Overshoot Day is basically a measurement of when during a year does the world use up all its available resources that grew through natural income during that year. And if we go back to like the 70s, we would make it most of the year without overshooting. Like we would make it to December until we overshot our carrying capacity, meaning it took us 11 months to consume 12 months worth of stuff, which wasn't that bad, meaning we were kind of unsustainable, but not by a whole lot. But if you look at the 2000s, we are reaching overshoot by August, meaning it's only taking us 7 months to use up all of the natural capital gains of 1 year. And then during the last third of the year, from August through December, we're basically borrowing against our future, basically dipping into the savings, going into credit card debt. Another way to look at it, the way that we live, as of the year 2017, we basically require 1.7 Earths. And unfortunately, we only have one. All right, so in terms of the blame game, you know, I've often hear like, we talk about India and China because they have so many people, over 1 billion people, that they're the ones using up so much resources. But again, let's look at this mathematically. You got 1.3 billion people in India, and 320 million people in the United States. You got about 4 times as many people in India than the US. In India, the average person uses 2.2 acres of land for their lifestyle. Times 1.3 billion Indians, India as a population requires 2.6 billion acres of land. On that last slide, I think I told you there's like 33 billion acres. So India uses less than 10% of the Earth's land in terms of their needs. And India has way more than 10% of the world's people. So that's actually a pretty good ratio. Now the average American, I assume you have shocked faces right now, that your jaw is on the floor. The average American uses 24 acres of land. Now, there's 1/3 of 1 billion people here, but because we use so much land, we end up as a country using 4 times as much land as India. Almost 1/4 of the Earth's land going to our one country, and we are, let me do the math, I want to say less than 5% of the Earth's population. Yeah, we're about 4% of the world's population, and we're using about 1/4 of the Earth's resources. Okay, so to sort of wrap up this 8.4 topic, how do we relate carrying capacity to eco-footprint? Basically, our eco-footprint shows if we are living above or below carrying capacity. So remember that magic number of 4.3 acres. The average person in India is living below carrying capacity at 2.2 acres. The average American is way above carrying capacity at 24 acres. As I mentioned, environmental footprints vary by country. MEDCs are going to have a higher eco-footprint living above carrying capacity. The term that you need to know here is that's called an ecological deficit. So basically, the average American lives in an ecological deficit. Now, in an LEDC, where the average person is below carrying capacity, they're in an ecological surplus, meaning there's more resources available than what they're using. In the United States, we're using more resources than what's available. How do MEDCs do this? Like, if there's only 4 acres available per person, how are we using 24 acres? And going back to that video, The Story of Stuff, we borrow from the LEDCs. So in the poorest countries where the average person is using 1 or 2 acres based on their lifestyle, we basically steal or buy at pennies on the dollar their resources. And then we basically spread our reach as Americans, or other MEDCs. We shouldn't let Japan or Europe off the hook. We basically get those resources and use eco-footprint, use resources beyond our actual national borders. wrapping up, this is important. Seems pretty obvious, but it's in the ESS guide, so I want to make sure that we're clear on it. EVS can determine a group's eco footprint based on your the way you view yourself and nature. Is going to determine whether you are leaving a consumption-based lifestyle, if you're okay with the linear system of take, or if you're living in more of that closed loop, restorative and more sustainable lifestyle. I really like this diagram. Is it about the ego or the eco? The eco puts humans sort of in the middle of nature. The ego puts us as the top, the most important part of nature. Some interesting connections to religion here between I guess, more animalistic or pre-Christian Judeo religions versus modern Western religion. Okay, so to wrap up, how do we reduce our eco footprint and actually go below carrying capacity? There's two ways to do this. We could be proactive or retroactive. So proactive approaches would be slow population growth, and we'll get into all the details of that in 8.1. Reduce our resource use, less meat, green transportation, less consumerism, relying on technology. Or we could be retroactive and kind of let nature do this for us. Go to war with each other, spread disease all over the planet because we're too clustered together, which is actually happening. Famine and resource depletion. So we'll end it on the positive note of famine, war, and plague. All right, bye. See you in class.